The Korean Mafia boss signed the divorce papers with a smirk of pure, cold pride, as if he were finally cutting away a useless anchor. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look up. He didn't even notice the way her knuckles turned white as she gripped her silky dress. No one in that room knew the truth. In just 6 months, this same ruthless man would lose his mind, and he would burn his entire empire to ashes just to find the woman he dismissed without a second thought. The gold pen scratched with lethal finality, ending a marriage forged in blood. To Kangmi, the signature was a triumph, a way to discard baggage and become the monster the underworld demanded. He toasted his freedom with a cold laugh, unaware he had just signed his own death warrant. Across from him, Vera remained a statue of frozen elegance. She searched for a flicker of the man he used to be, found nothing, and walked out to protect the secret life growing inside her. As the doors clicked shut, Vera vanished into the soul night. Kangmi thought he'd won. He didn't realize that by cutting her loose, he had turned his only heartbeat into a ghost. Before the story begins, take a second to like and subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. The mahogany-paneled hallway felt like a gauntlet. As the heavy doors of Kangmi's office clicked shut behind her, the silence of the inner sanctum was replaced by the low, jagged hum of the syndicate's nerve center. Men in sharp, dark suits, wolves dressed as protectors, lined the corridor. They had been waiting for this. To them, Vera was a decorative relic, a silken thread that had finally snapped under the weight of Kangmi's ambition. The queen has been dethroned, a voice rasped. It was Jino, Kangmi's most loyal hound, leaning against a marble pillar with a cigarette dangling from his lips. He didn't straighten his posture as she approached. Tell me, Vera, does the air feel thinner out here without his oxygen? Vera didn't break her stride. She moved with a rhythmic, haunting grace, the hem of her white silk dress whispering against the floor like a funeral shroud. She kept her chin tilted at an angle that forced them to look up if they wanted to meet her eyes. Careful, Jino, she said, her voice a cool, steady blade that cut through the haze of smoke. A dog that barks too loud often forgets who holds the leash. Even if I'm leaving, I know where the collars are kept. A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through the younger soldiers, but the veterans stayed silent, unsettled by the predatory calm radiating from her. They expected tears. They expected the frantic clicking of heels as she fled in shame. Instead, they got a woman walking toward her own execution with the poise of a goddess. One of the men stepped into her path, his shoulder blocking the way to the elevators. He was a brute named Sang-woo, a man who measured power in bruises. Kangmi says your baggage now. And baggage doesn't get a car service. You walking to the slums? Or did you keep enough of his jewelry to pay for a bus? The mockery was thick, designed to strip her of the last of her dignity. Vera stopped inches from him. She didn't flinch. Instead, she reached out and straightened his crooked tie with a terrifyingly gentle touch. I am leaving with everything I came with, she whispered, her eyes burning with a fire that made the giant skip a breath. And you? You're staying in a house that's already started to burn. You just haven't smelled the smoke yet. She stepped around him, her shoulder brushing his with dismissive force. As she reached the lobby, the sheer scale of the syndicate's headquarters loomed over her, a monument to the blood they had spilled together. The glass doors swung open, and the humid soul night rushed in to greet her. The neon lights of the city bled into the puddles on the pavement, reflecting vibrant, broken colors. She felt the flutter in her womb then, a tiny, frantic heartbeat that grounded her. The men inside thought she was walking into the abyss of poverty and irrelevance. They thought she was a ghost before she was even dead. Vera didn't look back at the tower. She didn't look back at the silhouette of the man watching from the top floor window. She simply stepped into the shadows of a waiting black sedan, one she had paid for with her own hidden accounts, months in advance. The door closed with a muffled, expensive thud. Where to, madam? The driver asked. Vera looked at her reflection in the darkened window. The woman staring back was no longer a mobster's wife. She was a mother with a war to plan. Away from the dead, she said softly. Drive until the lights of this city look like embers. As the car pulled into the stream of traffic, Vera felt the silk veil of her old life slip away. She was gone. And in the office above, Kong Mi was still laughing, unaware that his empire had just lost its only soul. The black sedan was a decoy, a 3-block charade to shake any lingering eyes from the penthouse windows. Vera watched the neon blur of the syndicate's territory through the tinted glass, her hand resting instinctively over her stomach. At a rain-slicked intersection in Myeongdong, she tapped the glass. The car slowed, and she stepped out into the pulsing heart of the city's crowds, disappearing into a sea of umbrellas and translucent raincoats. She walked until her lungs burned with the cold, damp air of the Seoul night. In a narrow, trash-strewn alleyway behind a 24-hour internet cafe, she pulled the rose-gold phone from her clutch. It was a masterpiece of technology, encrypted by Kong Mi's best hackers, and to him, it was a tether. He would expect her to keep it, to wait for his call, to beg for a higher settlement, to weep into the receiver when the reality of her poverty set in. Vera looked at the screen one last time. No messages. No missed calls. Just the cold, digital glow of a life that had already ended. With a flick of her wrist, she dropped the device into a deep, oil-slicked puddle. A heavy delivery truck roared past a moment later, the crunch of glass and lithium beneath its tires sounding like a definitive amen. Vera, the wife, the queen, the baggage, was dead. She stripped off the white silk trench coat, the fabric far too recognizable, and stuffed it into a charity bin. Beneath it, she wore a nondescript gray hoodie and leggings she had stashed in her bag weeks ago. She pulled the hood low, shielding the high cheekbones and sharp eyes that had once commanded boardrooms. The bus terminal was a cavernous, liminal space smelling of diesel and cheap floor wax. It was the territory of the invisible, the laborers, the runaways, and the tired. She bypassed the automated kiosks, paying in crumpled bills at a far counter for a one-way ticket to a coastal town 4 hours south. A place where the wind tasted of salt and the people didn't read the social columns of the Seoul dailies. As she boarded the bus, the plastic seat felt hard and unforgiving against her back, a stark contrast to the Italian leather of Kong Mi's office. She didn't mind. The discomfort was a reminder that she was alive. The engine turned over with a guttural shudder, and the bus pulled out of the station. Vera watched the Seoul skyline retreat, a jagged crown of glass and greed. She thought of Kong Mi in his high tower, likely pouring his third glass of scotch, toasting his freedom to a room full of sycophants. He thought he had cut her loose to drift into nothingness. He didn't realize that a ghost has no strings, and a ghost cannot be bargained with. As the city lights faded into the dark expanse of the highway, Vera closed her eyes. The secret life inside her gave a soft, rhythmic thrum of presence. She wasn't Vera anymore. She was a shadow moving toward a shore where the name, Kong Mi, meant nothing, and where the monster she had left behind would never find his way through the fog. By the time the sun rose over the East Sea, there would be no paper trail, no GPS pings, and no silken threads left to pull. The underworld had its monster, but it had lost its heart. And monsters, she knew, eventually starved when they had nothing left to protect. The motel room smelled of stale tobacco and the sharp, artificial tang of cheap lemon bleach. A neon sign outside the window hummed with a rhythmic, dying buzz, casting a rhythmic pulse of bruised violet light across the peeling wallpaper. It was a far cry from the silk sheets and climate-controlled silence of the penthouse, but to Vera, the flickering shadows felt like a fortress. She sat on the edge of the saga mattress, her movements slow and deliberate. The thin walls carried the muffled sound of a television from the next room and the distant roar of the coastal wind, but in here, the only sound that mattered was the crinkle of thermal paper in her hands. Vera smoothed the small, grainy slip of black and white film against her thigh. It was a smudge, a blur of gray and white that most would find indistinguishable from static. But to her, it was a map. It was the only truth left in a world built on the lies of men like Kong Mi. Her thumb traced the tiniest flutter, the microscopic point where a heartbeat had been captured in a frozen moment of sound waves and science. "You're a ghost now, too," she whispered, her voice barely a breath in the dim room. She thought of the men in the syndicate, their faces twisted in mockery as she walked out. They saw a woman stripped of her status, a queen without a crown. They didn't see the weapon she was carrying. They didn't understand that by discarding her, Kami had inadvertently handed her the only thing he could never control, his legacy. Outside, a car door slammed, and Vera's body went rigid. Her eyes darted to the heavy iron bolt she had slid into place the moment she entered. She waited, counting the seconds by the thrum of the neon light. 1, 2, 3. The footsteps passed her door and faded into the night. The tension in her shoulders didn't fully dissipate, but she forced herself to breathe. She couldn't afford the luxury of terror anymore. Terror was for those with something to lose. She had already lost her home, her name, and the man she had once mistaken for a protector. All that remained was the mission. She looked back at the ultrasound. In the underworld, a child was often a bargaining chip, a target, or a burden. To Kangmi, this would have been a successor to be molded into his own violent image, a prince of shadows. But in this flickering motel room, the child was simply a life. "He will never find us," she promised, the words hardening into a vow that felt heavier than the gold she had left behind. "He will never know your name, and you will never know the smell of his blood-soaked world." She tucked the ultrasound into a hidden pocket of her bag, right next to the burner phone she hadn't turned on and the stack of cash that would buy her a new identity. She lay back on the thin pillow, her hand resting protectively over the slight curve of her stomach. In the silence of the room, the neon light finally flickered and died, plunging her into total darkness. Vera didn't mind. The dark was where ghosts were strongest, and for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what was hiding in the shadows. She was the shadow. As sleep finally began to pull at her, she felt it again, that phantom pulse, that tiny, defiant heartbeat. It was a quiet drumbeat of war, and she would guard it until the world forgot that Vera ever existed. The rain in the coastal town of Saksho didn't fall, it commanded. It lashed against the windows of the small, sterile clinic with a rhythmic violence that mirrored the storm raging inside the delivery room. There were no silk sheets here, no private security details guarding the perimeter, and no bouquet of white lilies sent by a husband who saw a child as a strategic asset. There was only the smell of antiseptic, the flickering of a fluorescent bulb, and the raw, guttural strength of a woman who had spent 9 months erasing herself. Vera gripped the side of the metal cot, her knuckles white, her breath hitching in a jagged cadence. She was Minna here, a quiet widow with a tragic past and a humble bank account. But as the final, agonizing wave of labor took hold, she felt the last remnants of her old life burning away in the heat of the effort. When the cry finally broke through the roar of the wind outside, it wasn't a wail of defeat. It was a sharp, demanding sound that cut through the room like a silver blade. The nurse, a silver-haired woman with hands toughened by decades of salt and toil, wrapped the infant in a faded flannel blanket. She leaned down, a look of startled wonder crossing her face. "A strong girl," the nurse whispered, cleaning the child's face. "And look at those eyes. She isn't even an hour old, and she's already judging the world." When they placed the baby in Vera's arms, the breath left her lungs for a reason that had nothing to do with pain. Vera looked down into the face of her daughter, and for a terrifying heartbeat, the motel room and the coastal clinic vanished. She was back in that mahogany-paneled office in Seoul. The infant didn't have the soft, wandering gaze of a newborn. Her eyes were a piercing, stormy gray, unyielding, intense, and terrifyingly familiar. They were Kangmi's eyes. The same eyes that had watched men beg for mercy without blinking. The same eyes that had looked at Vera across a divorce settlement and seen only an obstacle to be cleared. But in this tiny, fragile face, that steel gray intensity felt different. It wasn't the gaze of a monster, it was the gaze of a survivor. "Elena," Vera whispered, the name a secret she had carried since the 3rd month. It sounded like a prayer and a warning all at once. Elena didn't turn away. She stared up at her mother with a preternatural focus, her tiny brow furrowed, as if she were already memorizing the contours of the woman who had saved her. In that look, Vera saw the double-edged sword of her daughter's heritage. Elena had his blood, the fire, the focus, the lethal intelligence that had built an empire. But she would have Vera's soul. Vera pulled the blanket tighter, shielding those silver eyes from the flickering hospital light. She knew then that her work was only beginning. It wasn't enough to hide. She had to build. She had to take the raw, dangerous power reflected in her daughter's gaze and forge it into something that wouldn't break when the past eventually came knocking. As the storm outside began to break, leaving only the salt-heavy mist against the glass, Vera pressed a kiss to Elena's forehead. The tiniest flutter was now a physical weight, a living, breathing testament to a marriage that had died so a queen could be born. Kangmi had wanted a monster for his underworld. He had no idea that hundreds of miles away, in a room that smelled of sea salt and cheap soap, a much more formidable force had just opened its eyes. The scotch no longer tasted like victory, it tasted like ash. 5 years had passed since the gold pen had scratched its finality across the divorce papers, and in that time, Kangmi had become the undisputed king of the soul underworld. He was the monster he had always aspired to be, cold, untouchable, and utterly alone in a fortress of glass and steel. He sat at his desk, the city lights hemorrhaging through the floor-to-ceiling windows, when Gino entered. The loyal hound didn't swagger this time. His face was a mask of calculated dread as he placed a single, grainy photograph on the mahogany surface. "We found the doctor who handled the private offshore accounts," Gino whispered, his voice cracking. "The ones Vera used to disappear." He thought he was being clever, hiding the medical files in a ghost server. Kangmi didn't look up at first. "Vera is a ghost, Gino. Ghosts don't have medical files. It's not just hers, boss." Kangmi's hand froze over his glass. He pulled the photo toward him. It wasn't a picture of Vera. It was a scanned copy of a birth registry from a seaside clinic, dated 7 months after the heavy doors of this office had clicked shut. Beside it was a grainy, zoomed-in shot from a street camera in a coastal town. A woman with Vera's unmistakable silhouette holding the hand of a small child. The glass in Kangmi's hand shattered. He didn't flinch as the shards bit into his palm, the expensive scotch mixing with the dark crimson of his blood. He stared at the child in the photo. Even through the digital noise of the surveillance feed, he saw it. The tilt of the head, the unyielding, predatory stillness. But it was the eyes, even in grayscale, that stopped his heart. They were his own. A daughter. In an instant, the freedom he had toasted for half a decade revealed itself for what it was, a cage. He had discarded his wife to protect his empire, never realizing he had sent his only legacy into the wind. The silence in the room became deafening, a vacuum that sucked the air from his lungs. "She was pregnant," Kangmi said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that made the shadows in the room seem to darken. "When she stood right there, looking for a reason to stay, she was carrying my blood. We didn't know, boss. Nobody knew." Kangmi surged to his feet, swept the crystal decanter off the desk, and watched it explode against the far wall. The roar that left his throat wasn't human. It was the sound of a man realizing he had spent years reigning over a kingdom of nothing. "Find her," he commanded, leaning over the desk, his blood dripping onto the map of the city he supposedly owned. "I don't care if you have to burn every port from Incheon to Busan. I don't care if you have to tear the tongue out of every informant in the country. If a single hair on that child's head is touched by anyone but me, I will bury this entire syndicate in a nameless grave." Gino scrambled backward, signaling the men outside. Within minutes, the quiet efficiency of the tower was replaced by a frantic, violent energy. Engines roared in the garage below. Encrypted lines hummed with commands that would destabilize the city's peace. Kangmi walked to the window, pressing his bloodied hand against the cool glass. He looked out at the Soul Knight, but he didn't see his empire anymore. He saw a ghost he had created, and a little girl with stormy gray eyes who was the only thing in the world he couldn't buy, break, or command. "Vera," he hissed, his reflection twisted by the red smear on the pane. "You think you can keep what is mine? I built this world to be a monster. Now, I'll burn it down just to find you." The hunt had begun, but for the first time in his life, the great Kangmi wasn't hunting an enemy. He was hunting the only piece of his soul he had ever accidentally let go. The cobblestone streets of Prague's old town were a labyrinth of history and secrets, a far cry from the salt-sprayed cliffs of Sokcho. Here, under the watchful gaze of Gothic spires and the mechanical tick of the horloge, Vera had spent a decade weaving a new shroud of invisibility. But as the winter wind whipped through the Vltava valley, the air tasted of more than just snow. It tasted of iron and gunpowder. Vera stood in the shadows of a vaulted stone doorway, her eyes scanning the Christmas market crowds with the practiced precision of a sniper. She was no longer the porcelain queen of soul. Her hands were calloused from a decade of quiet labor, and her face was a map of vigilance. "You're doing it again, Mom." The voice was low, melodic, and carried a rhythmic edge that made Vera's spine stiffen. Elena stepped out from a nearby stall, clutching a paper cone of roasted chestnuts. At 16, she was a striking, jagged silhouette against the festive lights. She wore a heavy black combat jacket and boots that had seen too many miles, her silver-gray eyes reflecting the flickering candles of the market like polished flint. "Doing what?" Vera asked, her voice a calm anchor. "Looking for ghosts," Elena replied, popping a chestnut into her mouth. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked through it. The two men in the tan overcoats by the clock tower. They've passed that Tridelnik stand 3 times. They aren't hungry, and they aren't tourists. They're predators. Vera felt a cold bloom of pride and terror in her chest. She had raised Elena to be a ghost, but the girl had been born a hunter. The tiniest flutter had grown into a fierce, unyielding young woman who could read a room before she even entered it. Elena didn't just carry Kangmi's eyes. She carried his innate sense of the kill. "Don't stare, Elena," Vera whispered, gently guiding her daughter toward a narrow side street. "I'm not staring. I'm ranging," Elena countered, her pace effortless. "They aren't Dad's men. The shoes are wrong. Too loud. Too cheap. These are local wolves. The Petrov Syndicate." Vera didn't answer, which was an answer in itself. The local Russian Czech faction had been sniffing around their neighborhood for weeks, sensing a vacuum of power where Minna and her daughter lived. They didn't know who Vera was, not yet, but they knew she was a woman with no visible protection and a daughter who looked like royalty in exile. As they turned into a darkened alleyway, the two men in tan coats accelerated. The heavy thud of their boots on the wet stone echoed like a countdown. Vera reached into her coat, her fingers closing around the cold grip of a suppressed pistol she had hoped she would never have to use again. But before she could draw, Elena moved. It was a blur of calculated violence. Elena didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She pivoted on her heel, using the momentum of her heavy bag to sweep the lead man's legs out from under him. As he hit the ground with a sickening crack, she was already on the second man, her hand a blur as she jammed a tactical pin, a gift Vera had given her for her 14th birthday, into the soft meat of his shoulder. "Get back," Vera hissed, pulling Elena behind her as she leveled the firearm at the groaning men. Elena stood tall, her breath barely elevated, her stormy eyes burning with a dark, terrifying thrill. She didn't look afraid. She looked alive. "They're just scouts, Mom," Elena said, wiping a smudge of slush from her sleeve. "If they're here, the main pack is already at the apartment." Vera looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and realized that the hiding was over. The shadows of Prague could no longer contain the fire she had tried so hard to dampen. The rival syndicate was closing in, but they weren't the only threat. By defending themselves, they had left a trail of blood and broken bone that would act as a beacon across the world. "We leave tonight," Vera said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with the weight of the inevitable. Elena nodded, a grim, knowing smile touching her lips. "Good. I'm tired of the architecture anyway. Where to next? Somewhere they'll see us coming." Vera looked at the girl who was half monster, half miracle, and knew the truth. The ghost had become a warrior, and the world was about to find out that some secrets are better left buried. The glass-walled safe house on the outskirts of Berlin was a cage of absolute transparency. Outside, the rain turned the forest into a blurred charcoal sketch, but inside, the air was static with the scent of ozone and old, bitter blood. Kong Mi stood by the hearth, his tailored suit a sharp contrast to the jagged reality of his soul. He had burned half of Europe to find this room. He had anticipated many things: an ambush, Vera's tears, a plea for mercy. He had not anticipated the girl standing in the center of the room, her feet planted firmly on the polished concrete, looking at him as if he were a specimen under a microscope. The silence lasted until it became a physical weight. Kong Mi moved first, stepping into the light. He searched her face for a trace of himself and found it in terrifying abundance. The stormy gray eyes didn't flinch. They didn't even blink. "Elena," he said, the name sounding foreign and fragile in his throat. "I've spent a lifetime looking for things I've lost. I didn't realize I'd lost the only thing that mattered." He reached out, a tentative gesture from a man who usually took what he wanted by force. He expected her to recoil. Instead, Elena stepped forward, meeting him halfway, her expression one of cold, clinical observation. "You didn't lose me," she said, her voice a low, steady chime that lacked even a hint of a daughter's warmth. "You discarded the idea of me before I was even born. You signed a paper to be a monster, and you succeeded. Why are you here now? To see if the baggage you threw away grew into something you could use." Kong Mi's hand dropped. The words hit harder than any bullet he had ever taken. The pride that had sustained him, the idea that he was a king reclaiming his throne, began to fray at the edges. "I am your father. Everything I have built, the empire, the power, the wealth, it's your birthright. I can give you the world." Elena let out a short, hollow laugh that echoed Vera's grace, but carried a lethal edge. She walked around him, her eyes scanning his expensive watch, his scarred hands, the desperate hunger in his gaze. "You think the world is something you can wrap in a bow and hand over?" she asked, stopping inches from him. She was shorter than him, but she seemed to tower over his spirit. "You built a world of shadows and corpses. You think I want to inherit a graveyard? It's for your protection," he hissed, the old, violent instinct rising to defend his ego. "The world is cruel, Elena. I made myself a devil so no one could touch what is mine. And look at the result," she countered, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut like a razor. "You're a man who has everything and possesses nothing. You destroyed a woman who loved you. You missed every breath of my life. You destroy everything you touch, Kong Mi. Even now, standing here, you're trying to turn me into a weapon for your own vanity." She reached out and touched the lapel of his suit with a mocking gentleness. "I have your eyes," she said, staring directly into the gray depths of his soul. "I see exactly what you are. You aren't a king. You're just a lonely man standing in a very expensive ruin. You didn't come here to save us. You came here because you realized that without us, you're just a ghost waiting for a grave." Kong Mi felt the final pillar of his pride crumble. He had expected hate. He could have handled hate. But her pity was a terminal blow. He looked past her to the doorway, where Vera stood in the shadows, her face unreadable but her posture victorious. She had done the one thing he could never do. She had raised a person who was truly free. Elena stepped back, the light of the fire catching the steel in her gaze. "Go back to your towers, boss. Rule your ghosts. But don't ever call yourself my father again. A father builds. You only burn." She turned her back on him, the ultimate insult in his world, and walked toward her mother. Kong Mi stood alone in the center of the glass house, the king of a dead empire, watching the only two people who mattered vanish into the rainy dark, leaving him with nothing but the echo of his own hollow heartbeat. The air in the abandoned shipyard warehouse was thick with the smell of stagnant seawater and the metallic tang of rusted iron. This was the underworld stripped of its velvet curtains and mahogany desks, a place where debts were settled in bone and marrow. Vera and Elena were bound to heavy wooden chairs in the center of the kill floor, the Petrov Syndicate soldiers circling them like sharks in the dim, flickering light of overhead sodium lamps. But their eyes weren't on their captors. They were fixed on the heavy sliding door at the far end of the hall. When the door groaned open, Kong Mi didn't enter with a small army. He didn't come with the roar of engines or the stutter of gunfire. He walked in alone, his silk suit jacket discarded, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the scars of 1,000 forgotten battles. For the first time in his life, the great Kang Mi looked mortal. "I told you to come alone," the Petrov leader rasped, stepping out of the shadows with a jagged combat knife. "I didn't think the King of Seoul had the stomach for a solo parley." Kang Mi didn't look at the man. His gray eyes, usually so cold and predatory, were fixed on Elena. He saw the bruise on her cheek and the defiant fire still burning in her gaze. He looked at Vera, whose silent dignity, even in chains, was a sharper rebuke than any blade. "I'm not here to parley," Kang Mi said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that commanded the room's oxygen. "I'm here to settle the debt. You want the territory. You want the shipping routes. You want the head of the man who humiliated your father. Take them." He stopped 10 feet from the Petrov leader and did something the underworld would whisper about for decades. He lowered himself. Slowly, with the deliberate grace of a falling monument, Kang Mi sank to his knees on the grime-covered concrete. The sound of his knees hitting the floor was louder than a gunshot. "Dad, don't," Elena breathed, the word dad slipping out not as a title of endearment, but as a shocked recognition of the sacrifice. Vera's breath hitched. She had seen him kill, she had seen him conquer, but she had never seen him humble. To a man like Kang Mi, his pride was his armor. By kneeling, he was flaying himself alive. "Let them go," Kang Mi commanded, his eyes never leaving the Petrov leader's face. "The accounts are transferred. The titles are signed. My life for theirs. That was the deal." The Petrov leader laughed, a wet, ugly sound. He stepped forward and delivered a heavy kick to Kang Mi's ribs. Kang Mi spiraled to the floor, but didn't cry out. He didn't fight back. He simply pushed himself back up to his kneeling position, coughing a spray of crimson onto the floor. Again, the leader hissed, signaling his men. The beating was methodical and brutal. They used lead pipes and heavy boots, the rhythmic thud of impact echoing through the hollow warehouse. Vera turned her head away, her eyes squeezed shut, but Elena watched every second. She watched the man who destroyed everything he touched allow himself to be destroyed. She saw the blood soak through his white shirt, saw his breath become a ragged wheeze, yet he never once lowered his head. He was paying for 16 years of absence with every broken bone. He was paying for the gold pin and the lethal finality of that office 5 years ago. "Enough," the Petrov leader finally signaled, panting. He looked at the ruined man on the floor, unsettled by the lack of fear in Kang Mi's battered face. "They're free. But if I see you in Europe again, I'll finish the job." The soldiers sliced the plastic ties on Vera and Elena's wrists. Elena was the first to reach him, her hands trembling as she hovered over his shattered frame. Kang Mi looked up, one eye swollen shut, the other still a defiant, stormy gray. "Go," he croaked, reaching out a bloodied hand to touch the hem of her jacket. "Vera, take her. Get to the docks. The boat is waiting." Vera stood over him, her silhouette a pillar of mourning and rebirth. She looked at the man she had loved, hated, and outlived. She didn't offer a forgiveness she wasn't ready to give, but she reached down and took his hand, pulling him upward just enough to steady him. "You're coming with us," she said, her voice a steel cable of resolve. "Not as a king, not as a monster, but as a man who finally knows what it costs to be a ghost." As they moved toward the exit, the sun began to bleed over the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the warehouse floor. Kang Mi leaned on the 2 women he had spent his life losing, walking away from his empire and into the blinding, uncertain light of a world where he was finally nothing. The Mediterranean sun was a warm, golden weight against Vera's shoulders, a stark contrast to the cold, lethal scratch of the gold pin that had once defined her life. In this small, terraced village clinging to the Italian cliffs, the air didn't smell of diesel or gunpowder. It smelled of salt, ripening lemons, and the heavy, sweet perfume of the climbing roses that spilled over her stone garden wall. Vera moved through the rows of flowers with a wicker basket hooked over her arm, her shears clicking with a rhythmic, peaceful finality. She stopped before a deep crimson bloom, its petals unfurling like a secret held too long. She remembered a time when she believed her only value was in her silence, her elegance, and her ability to anchor a monster to his humanity. She had spent years wondering if she had been enough to save Kongmi, never realizing that the question itself was a cage. A low, familiar whistle drifted up from the gravel path below. She looked down to see Elena, now 21, hauling a crate of supplies from the village market. Her daughter's hair was windswept, and her stormy gray eyes, once so full of a hunter's fire, now held a tempered, quiet strength. Elena had traded her tactical gear for the life of an architect, building structures that were meant to last rather than barriers meant to hide. Behind her, walking with a pronounced limp but a steady gaze, was the man who had once been a king. Kongmi didn't wear silk suits anymore. He wore a faded linen shirt and carried a toolbox, his hands scarred not by the violence of the underworld, but by the honest toil of restoring the ancient villa they called home. He didn't command the room. He merely occupied his space in it, a shadow that had finally learned to live in the light. He looked up and caught Vera's eye. There was no triumph in his expression, only a profound, quiet gratitude. He had spent years in this village proving he could be a man who builds, paying a silent penance in every stone he laid and every rose he watered. Vera turned back to her garden, snipping the crimson rose and tucking it into her basket. She realized then that the victory she had sought for so long wasn't in the destruction of the syndicate or the humbling of a powerful man. It was in this, the simple, quiet realization that she had never needed to be enough for anyone else. She had been enough for herself the moment she walked out of that office in Seoul. She had been enough when she chose a child over a crown. The heavy doors that had clicked shut all those years ago hadn't been the end of her world. They had been the beginning of her freedom. The ghost had finally found a body, and the heartbeat she had protected in the dark was now a symphony of a life well lived. As the evening bells chimed from the village square, Vera felt a profound stillness settle over her heart. The war was over. The blood had been washed away by the salt spray, and the monsters had been laid to rest. She sat on her stone bench, watching the sun dip toward the horizon, finally knowing that the only signature that ever mattered was the one she had written on her own soul. She was no longer baggage. She was no longer a queen. She was simply Vera, whole, vibrant, and finally, deeply at peace. If this story made you feel something, please like the video and subscribe to this channel for more.